What would you do if your child, your niece, or even your younger self were slapped in public, humiliated in front of 100 silent strangers? Would you stand up, speak out, or freeze like everyone else on a quiet flight from Los Angeles to New York? 13-year-old Zoe Reed sat sketching in her seat when a flight attendant's hand struck her head. Not for breaking rules, not for misbehaving, but for simply existing in a place someone thought she didn't belong. In that moment, the cabin turned cold, and every passenger faced a choice: speak up or look away. Now imagine it was your daughter, your sister, you. Would you have the courage to break the silence, or would fear of consequences keep you still? This is the story of one girl's shame turning into strength, of an uncle who refused to let dignity be negotiable, and of a mother in the cockpit whose single decision changed everything. It's a story about us, about what happens when ordinary people are forced to choose between silence and justice. Stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe. And let's step together into a story that will stay with you long after the plane has landed. The cabin had that late afternoon hush that only long flights can make. Overhead, bins clicked into place, air vents whispered, and a soft wash of white noise rolled down the aisle like a tide. Jonathan Reed sat in 17B with his shoulders square and his hands folded on his knees. The way he had learned to sit in boardrooms when everyone else in the room wanted to test him. He was 46, black, the CEO of Reed Global, and on purpose he was flying commercial today. No jet, no entourage, just a window of hours he hoped would belong to his niece, on his right, in 17C. Zoe tucked a pencil behind her ear and cracked open her sketchbook, 14 and wiry. She drew the way some kids breathe, quick and steady. She sketched everything: the curve of the wing outside the window, the reflection on the tray table, the crooked smile of a toddler 2 rows up. She always started with hands. Hands said more than faces. She liked to tell her uncle. Hands told the truth. Jonathan watched her for a beat, then glanced down the aisle. The flight attendants were moving in practice sweeps, stowing loose bags and checking seat belts. Across from him, a couple in crisp polos split a bag of pretzels and debated whether to order ginger ale or club soda, like it mattered. He had promised Zoe this trip months ago, a weekend in New York City, a promise kept after too many nights where his phone would not stop, even when the market closed, even when the sun was down. He was thinking about bagels and the Met and a detour to a small bookstore he loved in the village, when a shadow fell across the row. The flight attendant stood with her hands on her hips and a frown that seemed preloaded. Her name tag read C. Hayes. She was tall, composed, every hair in place, and already irritated. "That backpack," she said, pointing to the floor at Zoe's feet. "It does not belong there. Put it overhead. Now." Zoe looked up, startled. Her backpack had been tucked under the seat in front of her, the way the safety card said it should. She slid her pencil behind her ear again and nodded. "I can move it a little," she said softly. "I made sure it is under the seat. There is room. Not like that," the attendant snapped. "Overhead. I said now." Jonathan unbuckled. "I can help her," he said, calm, neutral, not a fight. He reached for the backpack. The attendant shifted one step closer, blocking his hand. "Sir, take your seat. We have procedures." He held her gaze. They were at ground, the door still open, the aisle barely crowded. He had learned to read people in half a second. This was not about a backpack. He felt the slow rise of a familiar heat in his chest, the one he had siphoned off into patience for most of his life. Zoe closed her sketchbook and hugged it to her chest. "I can do it," she murmured, slipping the strap over her shoulder. She stood, slight and careful, and edged into the aisle to lift the bag. "Do not drag your feet," the attendant said, voice low, as if to herself and yet to everyone. "Honey, if you want to sit up here, learn how to act." Jonathan heard it. Zoe heard it. The man across the aisle heard it and looked down at his shoes. The words were not loud, but they were sharp. They landed like glass. Zoe rose on her toes to hoist the backpack toward the bin. It was heavier than it looked. She had sketchbooks, a sweater, a bag of markers, a paperback, a camera her uncle found at a thrift shop. She reached higher, her wrist bent, the bag tilted. "Let me." Jonathan started, halfway up from his seat. The flight attendant reached first. She grabbed the backpack, yanked it, shoved it into the bin with a force that made the hinges clack. Then she turned back to Zoe with her face set in that precise, neutral smile some people wear like armor. "Seat," she said. Zoe nodded and stepped back into the row, trying not to bump the knees of the man in 17A. Her pencil slipped from behind her ear and bounced on the carpet. She bent to pick it up. The flight attendant leaned in, close enough that Zoe could see the perfect line of eyeliner, the pink gloss that did not move when she spoke. "Eyes up when I am talking to you," the attendant said. Zoe straightened, pencil in hand, clutching her sketchbook. The attendant's hand moved before Jonathan understood what he was seeing. A quick, flat crack of palm against the back of Zoe's head, not hard enough to knock her forward, but hard enough to make a sound that swallowed the row. Hard enough to make the toddler 2 rows up stop talking, hard enough to freeze the air. Time shrank to a pinpoint. Jonathan stood so fast his knee hit the tray latch and the little plastic tab stung. He did not raise his voice. He did not know where to put his hands. "Ma'am," he said, and even to his own ears his voice sounded dangerous in its softness. "That will not happen again." The attendant blinked once, steadying herself on the top of 17D. "Sir, take your seat," she said. "We are closing the door." Zoe did not cry. She did not move. She pressed her sketchbook flat against her stomach like a shield. Her eyes were wide, her mouth a tight line, her breath held between 2 ribs. Jonathan felt the rush of old rooms, an 8th-grade hallway where a principal told him he looked too intense and needed to learn to smile. A college seminar where a classmate called him articulate like it was a surprise. A boardroom where someone he paid more than they deserved asked to see his ID before letting him into his own meeting. He knew this story in too many versions. He turned to Zoe. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head once. Her eyes flicked sideways. The cabin watched him not watch them. The attendant, Ms. Hayes, shifted her attention down the aisle as if the moment were a ripple she could step over. She checked latches with the back of her hand, smiled at the couple in 18C and 18D, and did not look back at row 17. Jonathan sat, but he did not ease into the seat. He settled like someone perched at the edge of a decision. He knew all the reasons to let it go, to avoid an escalation on a plane, to protect his niece from a scene. He also knew every reason to refuse the quiet that follows a wrong. Next to him, Zoe slid the pencil under the elastic band on her sketchbook. Her hands shook the way a deer shakes when it has decided not to run, but cannot convince its legs to believe it. She took a breath that barely made a sound. "Say the word," he murmured. We can get off this plane." She shook her head again, harder. "No. Please. Uncle. New York." The light over the aisle flicked from open to closed. The door drew in and sealed with a soft hydraulic sigh. The plane's body shivered as the tug pushed them back from the gate, a slow inching that always reminded Jonathan of ships leaving a dock, of wrists sliding out of a grip. Across the aisle, a man with gray at his temples had watched everything with a face that looked like he had been holding a heavy box for too long. He leaned closer. "Are you all right?" he asked Zoe, voice low. "Do you need water?" She looked at him and tried to smile. "I am okay. Thank you." He nodded once and sat back, shifting in that way men do when they want to do more but have not yet found the way. A few rows behind, a teenager in a hoodie adjusted his phone angle. Jonathan noticed him only because the kid's shoulder lifted like he was steadying a camera. The lens gleamed black between the gap in the seats. The boy caught Jonathan's eye, then looked away. A quick flicker, like a signal that said, "I see you and I am seeing this." Jonathan let out a breath and counted to 5. He had invented rules for himself over the years. Count before you speak. Choose what you want to leave behind as the story of this moment. Ask yourself what protects the youngest person in the room. The plane swung and lined up. Engines rose to a pitch that lived in the chest. The captain's voice came from the ceiling, smooth and clear. "Good afternoon, folks. This is Captain Alicia Carter up front with First Officer Ethan Park. Our flight time from Los Angeles to New York will be 4 hours and 47 minutes once airborne. Smooth skies for the first half, a little chop over Indiana. We will keep you comfortable and safe." Safe. The word snagged on Jonathan's rib. The attendant who had struck Zoe moved past again. She kept her eyes on the row numbers. She paused to straighten a safety card that did not need straightening. She handed a blanket to the woman in 16A, a glass of water to the man in 18B. She did not look at Jonathan. She did not look at Zoe. Her face had become a mask for efficiency. The wheels left the ground. Los Angeles became a patchwork of roofs and swimming pools, bright blue squares shining like lost postage stamps. The wing flexed. The cabin tilted. A few people reached for gum. Someone laughed too loud at nothing and then made themselves small. When the seatbelt sign went off, the dance began. Carts appeared like tiny stages. Ice scooped into cups. Cans hissed. The smell of coffee replaced the smell of jet fuel. Zoe bent her head over the sketchbook again and drew the curve of the wing. Then the little rivets along its seam. Then her own fingers. Hands first. Always the hands. She drew the shape of a palm that was not hers. She paused there, pencil hovering. Jonathan looked at her sideways and felt a small tear in himself that had nothing to do with anger. It was the kind of tear that comes when you watch a person you love try to make a shape with their hurt that will let them keep going. He reached into the seat pocket and took out the in-flight magazine. He did not see the cover. He thought about leverage. He thought about the calls he could make from 30,000 feet. He thought about whether to be Jonathan the uncle or Jonathan the CEO. He hated that he had to choose. The gray-haired man across the aisle pressed his call button. No one came. He pressed it again. A few seconds later, the chime sounded and a young flight attendant appeared with his tie just slightly off-center. His name tag read D. Kim Daniel. He leaned toward the man with a voice that said he had not been on the job long enough to learn how to hide his nervousness. "Can I help you, sir?" The man lowered his voice, but not his conviction. "A member of your crew just struck a child in this row," he said. "I watched it. Others watched it. You need to address this." Daniel's eyes widened in that way that said he had hoped, maybe, that he had misread the tightness in the air around row 17. He swallowed. "I will report this to the purser right away," he said. He looked at Jonathan then, and Jonathan held his gaze. He did not say a word. Daniel nodded, like a person running a relay who had just realized the baton in his hand was heavier than he expected. He moved toward the front galley. The senior attendant, Ms. Hayes, was there, refilling ice and aligning cups as if order could absolve anything. Daniel leaned in and said something Jonathan could not hear. Ms. Hayes did not tilt her head. She did not ask a question. She kept stacking cups. Then she turned and swept her eyes across the cabin, and for a fraction of a moment, they landed on Jonathan like a dare. Jonathan felt Zoe's knee bump his thigh. He set the magazine aside. He did not have a plan yet. He had a boundary. That would be enough. He bent toward Zoe. "You want ginger ale, kid? The bubbles will help your stomach." She nodded, grateful for the ordinary shape of the sentence. He pressed the call button. He waited. No one came. He waited some more. He had a thought then that came like a message through fog. Some doors opened from the cockpit down, not the cabin up. He turned the idea over, testing it for risk. Zoe drew another hand. This one was steady. The toddler, 2 rows up, started talking again, and the sound of a child reclaiming simple happiness felt, to Jonathan, like the first sign of wind after a long, breathless afternoon. The intercom chimed, a single, flat tone, the kind that makes people glance up even when they do not want to. "Ms. Hayes," a voice said, "the cockpit would like to see you." There was nothing in the tone to tell the cabin what mattered, but Jonathan felt the cabin lean, in that collective way passengers do when they smell weather. Ms. Hayes smoothed her hair. She fixed the line of her jacket. She glanced, just once, toward row 17. Then she walked forward, heels quiet on the aisle carpet, and disappeared behind the curtain. Jonathan exhaled. He did not know yet whether the next minute would thicken or thin. He did not know whether anyone up front had heard or cared, or would do anything but send her back with a memo he would never see. He only knew that for the first time since the moment of the slap, the plane felt as if it might tilt toward right. Zoe closed her sketchbook and rested her palm on the cover. Her hand looked small and sure. She turned it over and studied the pencil dust on her fingertips, gray as ash. He looked at her and thought, that is the color of a line before it becomes a line. He waited. He was not done being angry. He was not done being careful. He was ready to be both. The curtain at the front of the cabin closed with a faint whisper of fabric. Carmen Hayes had gone forward. For a few seconds, the hum of the engines filled everything, a steady vibration in the ribs, the kind of sound that lets people convince themselves nothing unusual has happened. Passengers shifted in their seats. Someone unwrapped a sandwich with too much plastic. The couple in polos laughed a little too loud. The air bent itself toward normal, but row 17 was not normal. Zoe sat with her sketchbook closed on her lap. Her pencil rolled once, stopped against the edge of the tray, and she didn't bother to catch it. She kept her chin low, her hair falling like a curtain. Her hands pressed flat against the cover of the sketchbook as if the pages could anchor her in place. She was 14, and in that moment she felt smaller than she had in years. Jonathan leaned back but didn't relax. His shoulders stayed tight, his eyes trained on the empty aisle where Carmen had walked away. He knew that the human instinct after violence is to pretend it hasn't happened, to bury it under conversation and clinking cups. He knew the silence of the cabin was not neutral, it was complicit. A woman in 19A slipped her earbuds in and looked out the window. A man in 16D scrolled through his phone as if a new email could erase what his eyes had just seen. No one wanted to hold the weight of it. Jonathan had carried that weight since boyhood. He knew how heavy it could be. He knew how it could press on your chest until you stopped believing you had air to breathe. He turned his gaze to Zoe. She was still, too still. He touched her wrist lightly. "You okay?" he asked, voice pitched low so it would not carry. Her mouth moved before her voice. "I didn't do anything wrong." The words cracked like glass, sharp and quiet. "I just sat here." He nodded once. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "Not then, not now, not ever." She blinked, fast, as if to push back tears she had promised herself not to show. She remembered her mother's voice from long ago. "Don't cry in front of people who want to see you small." Her mom had said it when kids at school teased her for her skin, her curls, her name. Her mom wasn't here now, but the words were. Jonathan swallowed the ache in his throat. He thought about his sister, gone too soon, and the promise he had made to her, "I'll keep Zoe safe." But safety was a slippery word. He had wealth, a private driver, a penthouse with glass walls and guards, yet here, in this narrow row, in the hush of a cabin thousands of feet above ground, all that protection meant nothing. One woman's hand had erased the illusion of safety in an instant. The gray-haired man across the aisle leaned closer again. "Sir," he whispered, "I saw it. I'll stand by it. You don't have to let this slide." His name, Jonathan would later learn, was Richard Coleman. But for now, he was just a stranger with a steady voice, offering a sliver of solidarity in a sea of silence. Jonathan inclined his head in thanks. He'd lived long enough to know the value of even a single ally. Behind them, a boy's phone screen glowed faint blue. Diego Morales had angled his camera through the gap between the seats, hands steady in a way that suggested he knew the importance of proof. He didn't speak, he didn't move much, but the lens was open. Jonathan caught the flicker of it and met the boy's eyes for a beat. Diego looked down quickly, but not before giving the smallest nod, a signal that said, "I've got this." For Zoe, the minutes dragged. The smell of reheated chicken drifted down the aisle. The flight attendants, except Carmen, moved with mechanical efficiency, setting trays, pouring drinks. When one of them reached her row, he skipped her without asking. The can of soda clinked into 17A's cup, then into Jonathan's. The hand hovered over her tray, then pulled back, as if she were invisible. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Excuse me," he said, voice calm but edged. "She'd like ginger ale." He didn't ask. He stated it. The attendant's eyes flickered, uncertain. Then he poured the drink, set it down quickly, and moved on. Zoe stared at the bubbles as if they might tell her whether to drink or not. She didn't touch the cup. Her stomach clenched. She turned a page in her sketchbook, drew 2 quick lines that curved into hands again. Hands on the yoke of an airplane, strong, steady. She always drew her mother's hands when she was scared. This time, she drew them larger, bolder, as if they belonged to someone who could shield her completely. "Never show your tears," she whispered under her breath, repeating the old line. Jonathan heard her. His chest tightened. He wanted to tell her that tears didn't make her weak, but he knew now wasn't the moment. The lesson could come later. For now, she needed the armor. The cabin lights dimmed for dinner service. Shadows folded over the passengers. A hush deeper than before settled in. Jonathan looked around and wondered how many of these people would tell this story later. How many would say they didn't see or weren't sure what happened. He knew how silence rewrote history. He knew how easily injustice vanished when no one named it out loud. His mind slipped back years to a memory he rarely spoke of. 15. Walking home from school. A police cruiser pulled up. He was told to put his hands on the hood for no reason he could name. The hood was hot from the sun. His palms burned. His friend muttered, "Don't say anything, just wait." They were released with no explanation. His mother had cried that night. He had promised himself he would never bow his head again. And yet, here he was, watching Zoe shrink into herself, and the old helplessness clawed at him. The engines droned on. The hum pressed into his ears until it was all he could hear. He thought about calling a flight attendant back, demanding an official report, asking for the captain. But his mind ran through the consequences: confrontation in a confined space, possible escalation, Zoe trapped in the middle. The calculation was exhausting, unfair, but familiar. Always the burden of deciding how to resist without being destroyed by resistance. He looked at Zoe. Her pencil was moving again. She was drawing the outline of a horizon, a line that stretched wider than the page. He realized she was drawing escape. "Uncle," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the hum. "What if it was my fault? Maybe I put the bag wrong. Maybe I looked at her funny." Jonathan's heart cracked. He turned fully toward her. "Zoe, no." His voice had weight now, heavy but sure. "When someone hurts you for no reason, that's on them, not you. Do you hear me?" Her eyes glistened. She nodded, but he knew she didn't fully believe it yet. That would take time. The silence stretched on, oppressive, broken only by the clatter of trays. It felt like a waiting room before a verdict, everyone pretending they weren't listening for the sound of a door opening. Jonathan leaned back, staring at the overhead light. He measured his breaths. He thought about the calls he could make. He thought about leverage, about what power looked like when it was used in public instead of in boardrooms. But mostly, he thought about Zoe, and the way she deserved a world that didn't make her feel this way. Then, faint but sharp, a ding rang out the call button pressed from across the aisle. Richard Coleman had done it again. His face was calm, but his jaw was set. He wasn't going to let the silence win. The young attendant appeared, nervous. Richard spoke softly but clearly. "There is a problem with your staff. A child was struck. This cannot be ignored." The attendant froze. His eyes darted toward the galley, toward where Carmen had vanished minutes ago. I'll report it," he stammered. His voice was thin, but the words were real. Jonathan exhaled slowly. The silence had cracked. Just a little. Just enough. And for the first time since the slap, Zoe lifted her head. The hush in the cabin lingered like smoke, but the small break in silence from Richard Coleman had planted a seed. Jonathan watched Zoe out of the corner of his eye. Her shoulders were still tight, her hands clenched around her sketchbook, but her head was lifted now. The act of someone else speaking just a simple truth stated aloud had shifted the weight on her chest. Jonathan felt it too. The silence no longer had full control. Richard leaned back in his seat, gaze steady on the aisle, as if waiting for a response that might not come. His posture was unshaken, like a man who had sat in courtrooms and weathered longer pauses than this. He was not looking for comfort. He was demanding acknowledgement. Zoe turned a page in her sketchbook and began tracing faint outlines of eyes wide, searching. Jonathan glanced at them and knew what they meant. People saw, but will anyone care? The attendant, Daniel Kim, returned a few minutes later, his face pale, his movements tight. He bent close to Richard and spoke just above a whisper. "I've told the purser," he said. "It will be addressed." Richard nodded once, not satisfied but unwilling to push him further in the aisle. Daniel lingered for a moment as though he wanted to say more, then moved toward the galley again. Jonathan leaned closer to Zoe. "Sometimes justice starts as a whisper," he said quietly. "It grows when people don't let it die." She tilted her head toward him. "But what if it shrinks again? What if they pretend it didn't happen?" Jonathan's throat tightened. "Then we remind them, again and again, until they can't pretend any more." His words were steady, but inside he was weighing choices. Should he reveal who he was? Should he pull the CEO card, call for authority? The instinct pressed at him, but so did the memory of Zoe's small voice earlier. "I just want to go to New York." Behind them, Diego Morales shifted in his seat. His hoodie hood had slipped back a little, and the glow of his phone screen lit the curve of his cheek. Jonathan noticed the angle of the lens still steady between the seats. Proof. He had a witness who was younger than Zoe but already understood the power of a record. Jonathan filed it away. Later, if the silence tried to erase, Diego's video could shout. The carts rolled again, clinking with ice and cups. One attendant handed out trays. When they reached row 17, Zoe's meal was set down without a word. She picked at it, pushing the food with her fork but not eating. Jonathan unwrapped his roll, buttered it carefully, and placed half on her plate. "Eat something," he murmured. "Strength is fuel. You'll need it." She took a bite, small, tentative, but it was enough. A few rows ahead, Carmen Hayes reappeared, her face composed, her steps brisk. She moved down the aisle as if nothing had happened, as if she had not been called forward minutes earlier. Jonathan's pulse kicked. She didn't look at him or Zoe. She smiled at 15C, poured wine at 16A, tucked a blanket around a drowsy child in 18F. She passed row 17 with her eyes straight ahead, ignoring them completely. The message was clear. She would act as if they didn't exist. Zoe shrank a little in her seat, her fork clinking softly against the tray. Jonathan placed a hand lightly on her arm. "You do exist," he whispered. "Don't let her tell you otherwise." Carmen reached the galley again. Jonathan saw Daniel approach her, whisper something. Her jaw tightened, and she waved him off with a flick of her hand. Daniel looked back toward the cabin, his face troubled. He caught Jonathan's gaze briefly, then turned away, the weight of inexperience heavy on his shoulders. The air in the cabin thickened again. Jonathan felt the tension ripple through the rows, passengers shifting, pretending to read, staring at their phones. The hush was loud, oppressive. He could almost hear the thoughts, "Don't get involved, don't make it worse, just get to New York." But Richard Coleman did not buy silence. He leaned forward again, his voice carrying just enough for Jonathan and Zoe to hear. "I've seen too much to let this die here," he said. "If they don't act, I will." His eyes were fierce now, the kind of eyes that had watched protests turn to progress. Jonathan respected him instantly. Zoe whispered, "Why does he care? He doesn't even know me." Jonathan smiled faintly, though sadness tugged at his chest. "Because he knows what it means to be you in this moment," he said, "and because some people remember that silence costs too much." The plane hummed on, cutting through the sky. Jonathan's mind spun. He thought of the press, of lawsuits, of leverage through Reed Global's influence. He thought of his niece's face pressed into a sketchbook, of the burn on her spirit that would scar deeper than her skin. He fought the instinct to lash out and balanced it against the responsibility to protect her here and now. His internal dialogue was a battle: do I rise as CEO, or do I stay as uncle, which keeps her safer, which teaches her she belongs? Carmen's voice suddenly broke through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be dimming the lights for your rest service shortly. Please close your window shades." Her tone was sugar-sweet, professional. Jonathan almost laughed at the performance. It was as if the slap had been erased by the announcement, reduced to nothing. But Zoe hadn't forgotten. Neither had he, neither had Richard, and somewhere behind them, Diego's phone camera blinked red, its lens holding truth steady. Jonathan looked at Zoe again. She was drawing once more, this time a pair of hands, larger than life, holding a plane steady in the sky. Not Carmen's hands, not his, not even her mother's. Hands she had invented, strong, unshakable. He understood then she was creating the protector she needed, even if the world failed to give her one. He placed a hand over hers. "You're stronger than you know," he said softly. The engines roared a little louder as they passed through a patch of turbulence. Trays rattled, cups clinked, a baby cried 2 rows back. The plane steadied again, but the atmosphere did not. Everyone seemed more alert now, waiting. Jonathan could feel that something had shifted. The silence had cracks in it, and cracks let light in. Richard pressed his call button again. Jonathan almost smiled. Resistance had ripples, and they were spreading. The hours dragged on, and the hush in the cabin settled into a strange rhythm. Some passengers pretended to nap. Others stared too long at screens that had long gone dark. Jonathan felt time bending, like they were trapped in a bubble of tension 35,000 feet in the air. He kept glancing at Zoe, who had curled up against the window, sketchbook still clutched in her lap. Her pencil lines had softened into shapes of wings and horizons, her way of escaping, but Jonathan's mind was far from calm. Inside, he battled 2 selves: the uncle who wanted to shield Zoe from every sharp edge in the world, and the CEO who knew the weight of silence, the cost of letting injustice pass unchecked. Each second stretched that battle tighter. His chest rose and fell with the discipline of a man who had trained himself never to let the world see him lose control. But tonight, the world was watching, even if only in this one steel tube across the sky. At the front, Carmen Hayes stood near the galley, her posture rigid, her smile thin. Her eyes scanned the rows like a warden on patrol. The passengers avoided her gaze, sinking deeper into seats, grateful not to be the next target of her icy stare. Jonathan noticed how Daniel Kim, the younger attendant, lingered close to the service cart, stealing uneasy glances toward row 17. He looked like someone caught between loyalty to his senior and the nagging pull of conscience. The break came with a sound no one expected. The sharp ring of the interphone cut through the cabin, startling several passengers. Carmen stiffened. Her eyes flicked to the front, then to the ceiling, before she marched down the aisle toward the cockpit. Her steps were clipped, heels striking the floor in staccato beats that echoed against the hush. Jonathan's pulse picked up. He knew what that call meant. He had flown often enough, sat close enough to the cockpit to know the pattern. This wasn't routine. Carmen disappeared behind the reinforced door. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Zoe sat up straighter, eyes wide. "What's happening?" she whispered. Jonathan leaned closer. "That sound you heard, that was the cockpit calling her." He kept his voice even, calm, though his insides burned with hope. "They know. Zoe, your story's not invisible anymore." For several long minutes, the cabin was without Carmen. The silence thickened, everyone pretending not to notice that something unusual was unfolding. Then, the cockpit door opened and Carmen emerged. But this time, she wasn't leading. First Officer Ethan Park followed right behind her, his frame tall, his voice steady as he spoke for the entire cabin to hear. "Ms. Hayes, you've been relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Please follow me to the jump seat at the rear." The words sliced through the hush like a blade. Gasps rippled. Passengers straightened, some craning their necks to see. Carmen froze, color draining from her face. "Excuse me," she said, her tone incredulous. Ethan did not waver. "Captain Carter has issued a direct order. You are not to engage with passengers further. You will remain seated for the rest of this flight." Her jaw clenched, and for the first time, the authority she had wielded like a weapon cracked. She looked around, seeking allies among passengers, but no one met her eye. Even those who had earlier turned away now stared back, silent but resolute. Silence had shifted sides. "You can't be serious," Carmen muttered. "This is a misunderstanding." Ethan's voice carried steel. "This is not negotiable. Please follow me." Every eye in the cabin watched. Carmen's pride seemed to fight her body, but finally, she turned and walked stiffly to the back, Ethan following close behind. The sight of her retreating figure, stripped of power, was electric. Jonathan felt Zoe's shoulders loosen beside him. For the first time since the slap, she took a full breath. Richard Coleman, still steady in 18A, leaned across the aisle and whispered, "Justice has wings, kid. Sometimes it just takes the right pilot." Zoe blinked at him, then at Jonathan. Her lips parted. "She believed me," she said softly, almost to herself. "The captain believed me." Jonathan swallowed hard. He laid a hand gently over hers. "Of course she did. You told the truth. And the truth always belongs to you." The cabin slowly returned to its rhythm, but the air was different now. Passengers murmured, some nodding subtly in Zoe's direction. Diego Morales shifted again, his phone still steady, the red light blinking. Jonathan caught his eye and gave a small nod. Diego nodded back, his face young but resolute. Daniel Kim approached row 17, his hands carrying a blanket and a cup of water. He crouched slightly, his voice low and tentative. "Would you like this?" he asked Zoe. She nodded, her eyes wide with gratitude. For her, this tiny kindness felt monumental, proof that she wasn't invisible. As Daniel stood to leave, Jonathan stopped him gently with a hand on his arm. "Doing the right thing matters. Jonathan said. Daniel nodded, eyes misting, before moving back down the aisle. The plane hummed forward, outside. The sky stretched endless and black, dotted with faint stars. Inside. Zoe leaned against Jonathan's arm, blanket pulled to her chin. She whispered, "Do you think she's mad at me?" The flight attendant Jonathan considered his answer. He knew Carmen's anger wasn't about Zoe, it was about power. But how do you tell a 14-year-old girl that cruelty isn't personal, even when it feels like it is? He took a breath. "She might be," he said honestly, "but what matters is she doesn't get to decide your worth. Not today, not ever." Zoe clutched her sketchbook tighter. "I thought maybe I did something wrong." Jonathan turned so she would see his face, every word steady. "Listen to me. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. This was never about you being wrong. It was about her being wrong. Don't carry her mistake on your shoulders." Zoe's lips trembled, but she nodded. For the first time that night, she let a single tear fall. Jonathan didn't stop it. Some tears weren't weakness. They were proof you still cared, still had a heart big enough to hurt. He brushed her hair gently back. As the hours passed, the cabin dimmed into quiet. But the story of row 17 was far from over. Whispers floated between passengers, threads of conversation carried back and forth. People who had stayed silent before now leaned in, asked quietly if Zoe was all right. Richard Coleman scribbled something on a card, readying it for later. Diego adjusted his phone to save the file securely, and Daniel Kim made another quiet pass, checking Zoe's blanket as if she were his only passenger. Jonathan sat in it all, absorbing the weight and the relief, knowing the story had shifted but not ended. He knew from experience that what happened after landing often mattered most. But for now, one truth gave him peace. The silence had cracked, and from the cockpit came a voice of justice. And for Zoe, it was enough. She closed her eyes, leaning into the safety of knowing she had been seen. The night sky stretched forever outside the oval windows, endless darkness cut by pinpricks of distant stars. The cabin had finally grown quiet again, passengers either pretending to sleep or staring blankly at the seatback screens. But for Jonathan Reed, the stillness only deepened the storm inside. He knew the hardest conversations often happen not in boardrooms but in quiet, human spaces. Tonight, that space was about to be the cockpit. First Officer Ethan Park reappeared in the aisle, his presence calm and deliberate. He paused at row 17, crouching slightly so his voice carried only to Zoe and Jonathan. "Miss Reed," he said softly, "Captain Carter would like to see you in the cockpit when you feel ready." Zoe froze, her sketchbook halfway closed in her lap. Her eyes widened, darting between Jonathan and Ethan. "Me," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his expression gentle but firm. "Yes, only if you're comfortable." Jonathan placed a steady hand on Zoe's shoulder. He could feel her pulse racing beneath her hoodie. "It's okay. Zoe, you're not in trouble. The captain just wants to hear from you directly." Zoe's lips trembled. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Jonathan leaned closer, lowering his voice until it was meant for her alone. "The truth never sounds wrong. Just be you. That's enough." Zoe nodded slowly, drawing in a shaky breath. She set her sketchbook aside, the cover still showing the outline of her mother's hands she had sketched earlier. She smoothed her jeans with nervous fingers before rising. Ethan offered his hand as if to guide her, but she shook her head politely. She wanted to walk on her own. As Zoe stepped into the aisle, the passengers around them subtly straightened, watching. No one said a word, but Jonathan could feel the shift curiosity, unease, even admiration. This was no longer just a girl who had been slapped. She was becoming the center of a story larger than herself. Jonathan watched as she made her way down the aisle, each step small but steady. Ethan followed just behind, protective but unobtrusive. When Zoe reached the reinforced cockpit door, it opened with a soft click, and she disappeared inside. The cockpit was warm, filled with the low hum of avionics and the glow of countless instruments. Captain Alicia Carter sat in the left seat, her hands resting with quiet authority on the yoke. She turned at once when Zoe entered, her face softening from command to compassion. "Hi there, sweetheart," Alicia said, her voice both firm and kind. "Come on in." Zoe's throat tightened. I didn't mean to make trouble." Alicia unbuckled her harness and swiveled slightly to face her. She shook her head gently. No. Listen to me. You didn't make trouble. Someone hurt you, and that matters. My job is to protect every passenger on this plane, and especially you." Zoe's eyes glistened, but everyone just stared. Nobody said anything. Alicia leaned forward, lowering her voice. Sometimes silence is fear, sometimes it's guilt, but silence never makes them right. What matters is that you spoke with your eyes, even if your words got stuck, and I heard you. The tears came then, unbidden but cleansing. Zoe wiped them quickly, ashamed to cry in front of the captain. But Alicia reached out, placing her strong hand gently over Zoe's trembling one. "You belong here. Zoe, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Not on my plane. Not anywhere." Zoe drew in a shaky breath. "She hit me. For no reason." "I know," Alicia said firmly, "and she won't touch another passenger tonight. You have my word." For a moment, Zoe simply stood there, absorbing the glow of the instruments, the hum of the engines, and the certainty in Alicia's voice. The cockpit no longer felt intimidating. It felt like a sanctuary. "Would you like to sit here for a moment?" Alicia asked, nodding toward the observer's seat just behind her. Zoe hesitated, then nodded. Ethan adjusted the straps, guiding her carefully as she settled into the chair. From here, the world outside stretched infinitely, the horizon a soft curve of light against the darkness. Zoe whispered, "It's beautiful." "It is." Alicia agreed. "But you know what's even more beautiful, watching someone find their voice when the world tries to silence them." Zoe looked down at her hands. For the first time since the slap, she didn't feel small. She felt steady. She sat there for several minutes, breathing slowly, watching Alicia's hands move with confident precision across the controls. Each motion was deliberate, a reminder of what authority looked like when wielded with care. Finally, Alicia squeezed her hand once more. "You're safe here, Zoe. When you're ready, Ethan will walk you back." Zoe rose, her legs less shaky than before. She whispered, "Thank you, Captain." Alicia gave her a warm nod. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to remember you're never alone in this sky." When Zoe returned to row 17, Jonathan stood immediately, his eyes searching her face. She gave him a tiny smile. "She believed me, Uncle." She really did. Jonathan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Of course she did. You spoke the truth. That's stronger than anything." She slipped back into her seat, clutching her sketchbook. But this time, when she opened to a fresh page, she didn't draw her mother's hands. She drew her own, steady on the controls, eyes lifted toward the sky. Passengers around them had noticed. Richard Coleman leaned in quietly. "You did good, young lady. Don't ever doubt that." He slid a business card into her sketchbook. "If you ever need help, you call me. Civil rights attorney. Don't let this go." Zoe tucked the card close, her chest swelling with something she hadn't felt all flight strength. Jonathan placed his arm around her shoulders, his voice soft. "See, the truth travels farther than fear." The plane hummed on, cutting through the night. But for Zoe, the world had shifted. She had entered the cockpit a frightened girl. She returned with the seed of courage planted deep inside her. And Jonathan knew this story. Their story was far from over. The landing would bring its own reckoning. But for now, justice had taken flight, and Zoe had learned she could rise with it. The hum of the engines filled the silence as Zoe settled back into her seat. But something was different now. The girl who had left row 17 trembling returned with her chin lifted ever so slightly, a quiet strength beneath her features. Passengers who had earlier looked away now found themselves watching her, curiosity mixed with respect. Jonathan Reed noticed the shift. He had lived long enough to know that once truth breaks through silence, the atmosphere in a room or a cabin changes forever. Across the aisle, Richard Coleman leaned back, his hand brushing the edge of his notebook. He was taking mental notes the way lawyers do, careful to capture not just facts, but feelings. A civil rights case was a mosaic built on both. Diego Morales, still clutching his phone, glanced at Jonathan with a question in his eyes. Jonathan gave him the smallest nod. Diego's shoulders squared. He knew his recording mattered. At the rear of the plane, Carmen Hayes sat strapped into the jump seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. From his vantage point, Jonathan could see her rigid profile, a woman caged by the very rules she had abused. Her lips moved as if muttering to herself. It was pride refusing to surrender. Jonathan felt no triumph in watching her reduced. Instead, a heavy sadness pressed on him. He had seen too many lives poisoned by the illusion of power over others. Daniel Kim made another quiet pass down the aisle, this time with small bottles of water. He stopped at row 17, crouching to offer Zoe one. His voice was barely a whisper. "You were brave." Zoe hesitated, then whispered back, "I was scared." Daniel gave a gentle smile. "Bravery is just being scared and doing it anyway." Jonathan caught the words and felt a swell of gratitude. It reminded him of conversations he'd had with young analysts in his company, moments where truth spoken softly carried more weight than speeches. As the plane cut through the night sky, passengers began to stir with cautious whispers. A woman in her 50s leaned forward from row 19, her voice low but urgent. "I saw it," she said to Richard across the aisle. "The slap. I should have said something then." Richard's eyes softened. "The important thing is you're saying something now. If you're willing, your voice could matter later." The woman nodded. Guilt etched across her face. Jonathan watched and thought about the countless boardrooms where voices had stayed silent until one person finally broke the dam. Change never came without risk, and yet silence always carried the higher cost. Then Diego shifted in his seat, the glow of his phone screen reflecting off his determined face. He whispered to Jonathan, "This video. Should I post it? People need to see." Jonathan's instinct as an executive and guardian collided. On one hand, exposure was the surest way to force accountability. On the other, Zoe was still a child, fragile from the slap and the stares. He leaned toward Diego, voice steady but firm. Not yet. Save it, protect it. Sometimes timing matters as much as truth. When the plane lands, we'll decide together. Diego nodded, understanding more than his years might suggest. Okay, but I promise, I won't let them bury this. Jonathan gave him a grateful look. That promise matters. The intercom crackled suddenly, and Captain Alicia Carter's voice filled the cabin. Calm, measured, but carrying authority that wrapped around every row. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I want to assure you that our priority on this flight is your safety and dignity. If you have any concerns regarding what has occurred tonight, passenger relations officers will be available upon landing. Until then, please know you are in safe hands. Her words, simple and clear, settled over the passengers like a blanket. Jonathan saw shoulders relax, eyes soften. People needed reassurance, and Alicia gave it without drama. Only truth. Zoe clutched her sketchbook tighter. She's protecting me, she whispered. Jonathan smiled. That's what real leaders do. The minutes ticked by. Meal trays were collected. Cabin lights dimmed again, but the energy in the plane had shifted permanently. Where fear had silenced, now quiet solidarity simmered, and then, without warning, Carmen Hayes snapped. From the rear, her voice carried forward, sharp and bitter. This is ridiculous. Over one spoiled kid's lie, you'll all regret this when they hear my side. Heads turned. Murmurs rose. Daniel Kim froze mid-step, his tray shaking in his hands. Ethan Park appeared almost instantly, his stride long and unflinching as he reached Carmen's seat. His voice was low but clear enough for row 17 to hear, "Ms. Hayes, that's enough. Another outburst and you'll be restrained under FAA protocol." "Do you understand?" Carmen's mouth opened as if to spit fire. But the steel in Ethan's eyes forced her lips shut. She looked away, seething. The cabin buzzed with tension, but Jonathan noticed something else. People were no longer afraid of her voice. Instead, they looked disgusted, unified in their rejection of her cruelty. Zoe whispered, "Why does she hate me?" Jonathan's chest tightened. He turned so she could see his face, his voice quiet but certain. "Her hate has nothing to do with you. Zoe, it's her weakness, not your worth." Zoe absorbed the words, then turned back to her sketchbook. This time, she drew herself standing taller, hair pushed back, eyes wide open. Jonathan saw and thought she's already rewriting her story. As the hours passed, the hum of the plane lulled some passengers into uneasy rest. But Jonathan remained awake, his mind alive with 1,000 threads. He thought of his own battles in corporate America, the boardrooms where he had been underestimated, the deals where silence had almost cost him everything. He thought of Zoe, her small shoulders carrying the weight of a slap and an entire cabin's silence. And he thought of what awaited when they landed the reckoning that would define this night, not just for them, but for an airline and perhaps more. When the captain dimmed the cabin lights further, Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. He whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for courage for Zoe, for Diego, for every voice still learning to rise. Justice had begun its flight, but landing would decide if it endured. The cabin lights brightened slowly as the aircraft began its gradual descent toward New York. The shift in light stirred passengers from uneasy naps, pulling them back into the reality of what had transpired at 35,000 feet. For Zoe Reed, the slap still burned faintly on her skin. But something else pulsed stronger now, a steady rhythm of defiance. Jonathan Reed glanced out the window, the glittering expanse of city lights beginning to rise to meet them. Landing was minutes away, but he knew the true arrival would come once their feet touched the ground. Inside, he braced himself. He had faced corporate crises worth billions, but this, his niece's tears in a cabin of silence, was personal in a way nothing else had ever been. Zoe shifted, her sketchbook balanced across her knees. She drew lines faster than before, as if the urgency of capturing her feelings pressed against her fingertips. Jonathan peeked down and saw the outline of a cockpit, her mother's hands on the controls. But this time, Zoe added her own small but firm right beside them. The drawing made his chest tighten. She wasn't sketching escape anymore. She was sketching presence. Ethan Park passed quietly through the aisle, checking belts and trays, but his gaze lingered on row 17 for just a moment. His look carried reassurance. "You're not alone." Jonathan nodded slightly in acknowledgement. From across the aisle, Richard Coleman leaned in once more. "Mr. Reed," he said softly, his voice low so others wouldn't hear. "You understand the gravity of this. Your niece isn't just a child on a plane anymore. She's about to become the face of something bigger." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I know," he replied. "That's what worries me." She didn't ask for that weight. Richard's eyes softened. No one ever does. But voices like hers can change systems that boardrooms never will. "If you're ready, I'll stand with you. Pro bono. My card wasn't a courtesy. It was a promise." Jonathan studied him for a long moment, then inclined his head. "I'll hold you to that. Behind them." Carmen Hayes stirred again, shifting angrily in her jump seat. The turbulence of her silence seemed louder than words. Daniel Kim avoided her gaze, focusing instead on carefully stowing loose items, his hands slightly trembling. Jonathan watched the young attendant and felt empathy. Caught between hierarchy and humanity, it was a place Jonathan knew too well. Then, Diego Morales spoke up, his voice a whisper but urgent. "Mr. Reed, should I send this to someone now? News social media." He tilted his phone slightly, showing the paused video Carmen's slap, Zoe's frozen shock, the passenger's silence. The image felt heavier than any recording Jonathan had ever seen. Jonathan inhaled slowly, timing. He thought of markets, of negotiations, of how one release could shift power dynamics entirely. But this wasn't about stocks. It was about a girl who had been hurt and a system that had allowed it. He placed a steady hand on Diego's arm. "Hold it until we land. Then, yes, people need to see, but let Zoe choose when. It's her story." Diego's dark eyes widened, then softened with respect. "Okay, I'll wait. For her." The intercom crackled, and Captain Alicia Carter's voice once again wrapped around the cabin with calm authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into New York's JFK Airport. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure all belongings are secured. On behalf of Amerisky Airlines, I thank you for your patience tonight." The words were standard, but Jonathan could feel the subtle weight behind them. Alicia had not mentioned dignity this time, but everyone heard it between the lines. As the plane angled downward, Zoe leaned closer to Jonathan. "Uncle Jay, what happens when we land?" Jonathan's mind raced with the images of what awaited passenger relations officers. Media, perhaps, and certainly questions endless questions. He chose his words with care. We tell the truth. Zoe, that's all we need to do. Let them handle the rest. Her eyes searched his. But what if they don't believe me? Jonathan placed both his hands gently on hers, anchoring her. They will, because I believe you, because Captain Carter believes you, and because the truth has already started to fly. It's not coming down. Zoe swallowed hard, then nodded. Okay. The wheels dropped with a thud beneath them, jolting the cabin. A chorus of seatbelt clicks followed. Tension coiled again, less about the landing and more about what awaited. As they descended through the last layers of cloud, Carmen suddenly leaned forward in her jump seat, hissing low but audible enough for Rose nearby. You think this will ruin me, it won't. I've been flying for 20 years. They'll take my side over a child's word. Jonathan's eyes sharpened, but before he could reply, Richard Coleman spoke, his voice crisp, honed by decades in courtrooms. Not tonight, Ms. Hayes. Tonight, the world already saw. Carmen's eyes flicked toward Diego, realization dawning. For the first time, her composure cracked completely. Her face paled, lips tightening into silence. The wheels screeched against the runway, pulling everyone forward against their belts. The engines roared in reverse thrust, rattling trays and overhead bins. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, as the aircraft slowed, the hush gave way to murmurs, a tide rising. Zoe gripped Jonathan's hand. "We're here," she whispered. Jonathan squeezed back. "Yes, we are. And now, Zoe, now the real part begins." The plane rolled toward the gate. The cabin lights brought once more. Passengers gathered their things, their eyes darting often toward row 17. The woman from row 19 leaned forward again, this time placing a hand briefly on Zoe's shoulder. "You're braver than me," she whispered. "Don't forget that." Zoe looked up, startled but grateful. She gave the woman a small smile. For the first time since boarding, she felt seen not as a victim but as someone others looked up to. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He knew the walk from this cabin to the terminal would feel longer than any runway he had crossed, but he also knew something undeniable, a reckoning was waiting at the gate, and they would walk into it together. The seatbelt sign flicked off with a soft chime. Passengers rose in a shuffle of coats, bags, and restless energy. The familiar scramble of landing should have felt ordinary, but row 17 pulsed with tension. Everyone nearby stole glances, some curious, some sympathetic, a few ashamed for their silence earlier. Jonathan Reed rose slowly, measured, placing himself between Zoe and the aisle. He knew what was coming. His instincts, sharpened by decades of boardroom battles, told him that the landing wasn't the end, but the beginning of a larger fight. Zoe clutched her sketchbook like armor. She looked smaller again, dwarfed by the crowd tugging down luggage, but Jonathan saw the flicker in her eyes, the resilience planted in the cockpit, glowing faintly beneath her nerves. The door hissed open. A rush of terminal air filled the cabin. Waiting just outside stood two passenger relations officers in gray suits, flanked by a uniformed airport police sergeant. Their posture was professional, but Jonathan recognized the choreography of crisis management. The airline already knew. "Mr. Reed, Miss Reed," the woman in the gray suit asked, scanning the manifest in her hand. Her voice was calm, practiced. "We'd like to speak with you regarding the incident." Before Jonathan could respond, Captain Alicia Carter stepped forward from the cockpit. She removed her cap, tucked it under her arm, and spoke with steady authority. "They'll speak to me first. She's a minor. Any questions go through her guardian and myself." Zoe blinked up at Alicia, relief softening her shoulders. Jonathan's chest tightened with gratitude. In a world that too often bent under pressure, Alicia stood like steel. Passengers filed past, many pausing to offer quiet words to Zoe. The woman from row 19 whispered again, "You were brave." Richard Coleman shook Jonathan's hand firmly. "Call me tomorrow. We'll make sure this doesn't disappear." Diego Morales. Phone clutched tight, gave Zoe a small nod. "I've got your back," he mouthed before vanishing into the stream. Then Carmen Hayes appeared, escorted by Ethan Park and Daniel Kim. Her uniform looked suddenly ill-fitting, her face pale but defiant. "This is absurd," she snapped at the officers. 20 years of service, and I'm treated like a criminal because a child cried." The police sergeant lifted a hand. "Ma'am, step aside. You'll have your chance to speak." Carmen's eyes flashed toward Zoe. "You ruined me," she hissed. Before Zoe could shrink back, Jonathan stepped between them, his voice low but cutting. "She didn't ruin you. Your choices did." The words hung in the air like judgment. Carmen faltered, her jaw working soundlessly before the sergeant guided her away. Zoe exhaled, trembling. Jonathan bent close. "You stood your ground." "Zoe, that's more powerful than you know." They were ushered into a small lounge just off the jet bridge. Neutral walls, leather chairs, a pitcher of water on the table, the kind of sterile space designed to absorb conflict. The gray-suited officer opened her tablet. "Miss Reed, we'd like to record your statement, only if you're comfortable." Jonathan spoke first. "She'll answer, but slowly, respectfully. She's not here for interrogation." Zoe glanced at him, then at Alicia, who stood behind her like a quiet sentinel. Taking a breath, Zoe began. Her voice wavered but grew stronger with each word. "She hit me. For no reason. No one helped. I want this on record." The officer typed swiftly, her face unreadable. Jonathan watched her fingers fly across the screen, each keystroke a piece of Zoe's pain immortalized. When Zoe finished, silence stretched, Alicia finally spoke. "This will not be buried. I'll personally submit my report to the FAA." The officer nodded. "We'll also launch an internal investigation immediately. Ms. Hayes has been suspended pending review." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Suspended. A child was assaulted in front of an entire cabin. Suspension isn't enough. The officer hesitated, clearly weighing words. "Further action may be taken, dependent on evidence." Jonathan leaned back, his CEO presence surfacing like a tide. "Then you'll have evidence. Multiple passengers saw, at least one recorded, and you can be assured this will reach beyond your internal channels." The officer swallowed, nodding again. She looked at Zoe, softer now. "Thank you for speaking. Miss Reed, your voice matters." Zoe clutched her sketchbook to her chest, whispering almost to herself. For once, it did. The meeting ended. As they stepped into the terminal, the buzz of the airport swallowed them rolling suitcases, intercom announcements, the endless stream of lives in transit. Yet for Jonathan and Zoe, the world felt narrowed to a single truth. Silence had broken, and now the echo would spread. Zoe tugged Jonathan's sleeve. "Do you think it'll change anything?" Jonathan looked at her, really looked, and saw the girl who had endured shame, silence, and the weight of eyes that turned away. "Yes," he said finally. because you didn't disappear, and that changes everything." They walked on together, Alicia at their side, toward baggage claim and whatever waited beyond. The baggage claim area glowed with harsh fluorescent light. The belts rumbled, spitting out suitcases in mismatched colors and shapes. But no one in Jonathan Reed's party was paying attention to luggage. A different weight pressed on them, the weight of watching eyes. Clusters of passengers lingered near the carousel, whispering as Zoe Reed walked by, sketchbook still tucked close to her chest. Jonathan kept one arm protective across her shoulders, scanning the space with the wariness of a man who had navigated both media storms and boardroom ambushes. Captain Alicia Carter walked just behind them. Uniform crisp, gaze steady. She carried herself like someone ready to face whatever came, and it came fast. A voice cut through the din. "Reed, Mr. Reed, over here." A pair of reporters had appeared from the crowd, cameras hoisted, microphones raised. One of them, a woman in a blue blazer, stepped forward. "Is it true your niece was physically assaulted by a flight attendant during this flight?" The words hit Zoe like a gust of wind. She froze, her knuckles white around her sketchbook. Jonathan squeezed her shoulder gently. "Keep walking," he murmured, but the questions followed. Was it racially motivated? "Do you plan to sue Amerisky Airlines? Will you release the video?" Zoe's chest rose and fell quickly. Her eyes darted to Jonathan, searching. She wanted to run, but a flicker of defiance stirred. For once, she didn't want silence to be her cage. She slowed, tugging Jonathan's sleeve. "Uncle Jay, let me." Jonathan's steps faltered. He studied her face, saw both the fear and the spark. His instinct screamed to shield her, to sweep her past the cameras. But his heart knew this was the moment she could reclaim what Carmen had tried to take. He nodded once. "Go ahead. I'm right here." Zoe turned, small in stature but suddenly commanding. The reporters lowered slightly, surprised that the voice came from her. She spoke softly, but her words carried in the quiet pocket that formed around them. "She hit me. I didn't do anything wrong. Everyone saw, but no one helped. Not at first." She paused, clutching the sketchbook tighter. "I want people to know that it's not okay. Not for me. Not for anyone." A hush fell. The reporter in the blue blazer lowered her microphone, her eyes softening. Cameras clicked, but even they seemed less intrusive now, more like witnesses. Jonathan felt pride swell in his chest, so sharp it almost hurt. Captain Alicia Carter stepped forward, her voice like tempered steel. "And you can put this on record, this airline has zero tolerance for abuse. As captain, I relieved Ms. Hayes of duty mid-flight, and I will personally ensure the FAA receives my report." The flashbulbs sparked again. For a brief second, Jonathan saw something rare: accountability spoken aloud without corporate spin. But Carmen Hayes wasn't done. Escorted by 2 officers, she was being led through the terminal. Her voice, shrill with desperation, rose above the clamor. "This is a smear campaign. That girl is lying. You'll all see." Zoe flinched, but Jonathan stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority that had once swayed investors across continents. "No, Ms. Hayes. The world has already seen, and they'll keep seeing. Diego Morales, standing just behind the reporters, lifted his phone. With a tap, he sent the video to a waiting network of friends, activists, and journalists. A notification pinged almost immediately on nearby phones. Within minutes, the video would break into feeds across the country. Jonathan felt the air shift. The reckoning was no longer confined to Flight 417. It was spilling into the world. The police sergeant guiding Carmen shook his head, clearly weary. "Ma'am, that's enough." He tightened his grip, steering her toward a side exit. Zoe let out a shaky breath. "She still hates me." Jonathan knelt slightly so his eyes were level with hers. "Hate is powerless when truth is louder, and your truth just took flight." The reporters, sensing the gravity of the moment, pressed further. "Mr. Reed, what happens now?" Jonathan straightened, shoulders squared. "Now, we hold them accountable. Not just one flight attendant, not just one airline. We hold every system that allows silence to be louder than justice, and we do it starting tonight." The microphones captured every word. Alicia Carter gave a faint nod of approval. Richard Coleman, who had rejoined them after collecting his bag, stepped forward too. "And if you print anything, print this: justice doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts when a child refuses to be invisible." Zoe blinked, startled by the weight of Richard's words. Then, slowly, she lifted her sketchbook and held it against her chest, not as armor anymore, but as a banner. She had drawn herself standing tall on a runway, shoulders squared, eyes forward. For the first time, she wanted others to see it. The flashbulbs lit again, capturing both girl and sketchbook. A new image entered the world, not just of a slap, but of survival. The baggage carousel clanked as another wave of suitcases tumbled out. But for Jonathan, Zoe, and the small circle around them, the noise of ordinary travel faded. The terminal had become a stage. The story had become unstoppable. Jonathan looked down at Zoe, his voice low but certain. "We've crossed into something bigger than us. Are you ready?" Zoe's eyes glistened, but her chin lifted. "I think so, because I'm not alone." Jonathan smiled faintly, pride and sorrow mixing in his chest. "No, you're not anymore." The taxi glided through the New York night, headlights bouncing across glass towers and brick facades alike. The city hummed with its usual energy, but inside the car, the world felt strangely still. Jonathan Reed sat by the window, his reflection staring back at him, eyes heavier than they had been in years. Beside him, Zoe leaned against his arm, her sketchbook resting loosely in her lap. Captain Alicia Carter rode in the front seat, her posture still sharp, as though discipline never left her bones. Richard Coleman scrolled silently through his phone, the glow illuminating the deep lines of his face. Diego Morales, still buzzing from the adrenaline of the terminal, sat perched with his phone ready. Notifications flashed across the screen in rapid succession. "It's everywhere," Diego whispered. "Twitter, Instagram, even Facebook. Hashtag Justice for Zoe is already trending." Jonathan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to Zoe. She was awake, but quiet, staring out at the lights flickering past. He gently squeezed her shoulder. "How are you holding up?" She hesitated. "It feels weird, like I was invisible. Then suddenly everybody sees me. But they don't see me, not really. They just see the video." Jonathan's throat tightened. "They'll see more than that. They'll see your courage." Zoe tilted her head. "But what if they forget tomorrow?" The question lingered heavy in the car. Alicia turned slightly, her voice firm yet kind. "Then we remind them. Every single day if we have to. Change doesn't happen in one night. Zoe, but tonight you lit the spark." The car slowed, pulling up in front of the hotel. Cameras had already gathered. Journalists pressing against barricades. The lobby glittered with marble and glass, a sharp contrast to the chaos outside. Hotel security ushered the group in quickly, shielding Zoe from the flashbulbs. Inside, the hush felt sacred. Jonathan guided Zoe to a quiet lounge where plush chairs circled a low table. She sank into a seat, sketchbook propped against her knees. For the first time all day, she seemed small again, a child who had endured too much. Richard Coleman set his phone down. "I've spoken to a few networks. They want to air interviews tomorrow morning. We control the narrative now. But Jonathan, this will come at a cost. They'll dig into you, your company, your family." Jonathan leaned back, jaw tight. "Let them. My record is clean. If they want to expose anything, let it be the truth of what happened on that plane." Alesha's voice was measured. "The airline board will push back hard. They'll want to settle, to silence you." Jonathan shook his head. "Not this time. This isn't about money. This is about making sure Zoe never has to sit on another flight and wonder if her skin color makes her a target." Zoe looked up, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't want hush money. I just want them to admit it, admit what happened, and promise it won't happen again." Her words hit Jonathan like a compass needle snapping north. She wasn't asking for vengeance, she was asking for truth. That was harder, sharper, but also purer. The group fell into silence, the weight of possibility pressing down. Diego finally spoke, youthful defiance in his tone. "You don't need to wait for them to admit it. People already know. They saw it. They're angry. That's power." Richard nodded slowly. "He's right. Social change rarely begins in courtrooms. It begins in the streets, in conversations, in outrage that refuses to fade." Jonathan rubbed his temples, exhaustion sinking in. Yet beneath it all, he felt something deeper resolve hardening, like steel cooling into shape. He looked at Zoe. "Tomorrow, you can speak if you want to, or not. No one will force you. But if you do, know that your voice will carry further than you think. People will hear it in places we can't imagine yet." Zoe considered, eyes wide but steady. "I want to speak, not because I like the attention, but because maybe another girl out there feels the same way I did alone. And if she hears me, maybe she'll know she's not." The room quieted again, this time with a reverence that bordered on awe. Alesha blinked back tears she quickly disguised. Richard cleared his throat. Even Jonathan, who had spoken to presidents and CEOs without flinching, found himself humbled by the clarity of his niece's conviction. The night stretched long. Reporters camped outside. Messages poured in support, outrage, offers to fund lawsuits. Jonathan sifted through them, declining most. He wasn't interested in being anyone's symbol for hire. He wanted real change, not headlines. When the noise grew too much, he stepped out onto the balcony. The city sprawled before him, lights endless, a reminder of how small even the loudest voice could feel. But behind him, Zoe's soft laughter drifted from the lounge as Diego showed her memes people had already created in solidarity. She was smiling again, however faintly. That was enough to keep Jonathan rooted. He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer only the night could hear. Let this not be wasted. Let this hurt mean something. The next morning came like a tidal wave. News vans lined the block. Screens inside the hotel lobby glowed with headlines. Amerisky scandal rocks industry. Teen assaulted mid-flight. CEO Uncle demands reform. The world was listening. At breakfast, Zoe sat between Jonathan and Alicia, her sketchbook on the table. She had drawn a new image overnight, herself and her uncle standing together, facing a runway that stretched into the horizon. Above them, in faint pencil strokes, the words, "We belong here." Jonathan's chest ached as he looked at it. He traced the words with his finger, then kissed the top of Zoe's head. "Yes, we do." When they walked into the press room later, microphones bristling, Jonathan knew the fight was just beginning. But he also knew they weren't walking in as victims. They were walking in as truth-tellers, ready to demand more than apologies. The cameras clicked. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "This is not just about one flight. This is about an industry, about a country, about a little girl who should never have been made to feel less because of the color of her skin. We will not let this pass quietly, and we invite everyone who believes in dignity to stand with us." The room erupted with questions, flashes, noise, yet Zoe sat steady, sketchbook open, her eyes clear. For once, she wasn't invisible. For once, the world had to look, and Jonathan knew whatever storm lay ahead, they were ready. The story of Zoe Reed reminds us of a truth many of us learned late in life. Dignity is not given. It is defended. Discrimination often hides in plain sight, in the silence of those who choose comfort over courage. What happened on Flight 417 is more than an isolated act of cruelty. It is a mirror for our society. For older generations who have seen decades of change, the lesson remains timeless. Progress is never automatic. It requires each of us to step forward when silence tempts us to step back. Jonathan Reed's decision to confront injustice, Alicia Carter's resolve to enforce accountability, and Zoe's quiet bravery in speaking her truth show us three paths converging into one message: we belong. No matter who tries to erase us. In our daily lives, the application is simple yet profound. When you witness unfairness at work, in your community, even at your family table, remember that silence validates injustice. Speaking out may not change the world instantly, but it creates ripples, and sometimes those ripples are what carry the next generation forward. Every voice matters, especially yours. Thank you for spending your time with us and for opening your heart to this story. If it moved you, even in a small way, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real stories that remind us of our strength, our dignity, and our shared humanity. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter.